prepare for action in rude boy fashion. We sound clash on any pussy clapper wanna come test the champion.
Like you just don't care. And if you like fish and grits and all the pimp shit, everybody let me hear you say
6 million ways to spy, choose one.
Tank, I need a pilot program.
Peace and blessings, family. This is your brother asarimhotep with the Madhu Mandela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. We are here this Wednesday, April 29th, for the first, what I call Scholars Townhall Meeting. This is just an open forum discussion for discussing many different topics. So today, of course, we'll be talking about ancient Kemet, the Nile Valley, and probably Africa in general. The sounds that you heard was me. Many of y'all should know that I do not only photography and graphic work, but music production as well. So at the beginning of the shows, you'll probably be hearing some tracks, not because I'm trying to promote myself, but because when I play anything else, YouTube flags me. So y'all keep that in mind for everybody who has their own shows. Make sure you do you some royalty free or your original music, or YouTube flagged you. But anyway, as usual, I like to give a shout out to everyone who is listening live, not only on Facebook, of course, YouTube. We're simulcasting, and who was that on the other? Peace to Brother Taki with Hoppy documentary. Hopefully we'll get him on soon concerning his documentary called Hoppy, and it's an economics film, but rooted in ancient Kemet. Shout out to Amber Evans, Infinite Minds. I know I'm going to mess this up. So in Lugani, Yao, Sister Monica Lamb, Rakim 777. Hold on, let me go up a bit. Al Kebulon, HVAC, Don Williams, Brian Hess, The Pro-Black Perspective, Manuel Martinez, Meje Commander, Oronde Stokes, Ivan Vascateles. Who am I missing? Okay, good. And anyone else, he said good pronunciation of the name. I know I don't say it with the proper accent, but I'm gonna work on it. So I gotta hear it so I know how to pronounce it correctly. Peace to Brother Shezmu, Patah Amun, and anyone on. We have Sister Melissa on Facebook. First in, last out. My boy right there on Facebook, and there's some others I can't see in the chat out there. But peace to everyone. Peace to everyone who is going to catch us in the archives. And I don't know if y'all see my fresh background. Then I'm trying to green screen, so I'm on the edges. I'm gonna look kind of funny, but you might even see me switch the background as we have this conversation throughout the night. So, but let me do this. Kind of split the screen in three. We have two special guests with us today, and before I introduce them, I just want to say that for this, and I hope this is one of many discussions where individuals from a website that we call, actually we got a third member who just joined us. So peace. Let me kind of segue into everyone who's on the panel. So, before there was a thing that we call social media, in the early 90s and mid 90s going into the 2000s, to get this type of information, you either had to belong to a listserv, like an academic listserv, or you were on a message board forum. And, a long time ago, there was a message board created by the name of EgyptSearch.com. There was another one in Nile Valley that I don't think is up anymore, and various other, message board forums. So before you had a Facebook, before you had YouTube and all of that, people would come and post content concerning ancient, Egypt on a wide variety, of topics. And so EgyptSearch.com, I think I was lurking maybe a year or two without saying anything, but finally joining way back in 2007 and engaged in a lot of conversations there. And there's, even earlier than that, belonged to this Taseti Yahoo groups forum, and you would have people like Manu Mpim and Clyde Winters and a whole bunch of other scholars from back in the late 90s and early 2000s in that. Robin Walker, matter of fact, he had his own listserv, Robin Walker out of the UK. And, we would bring those conversations, back and forth to these various mediums, from the listservs to the online forums. And so basically over the years, I've been able to engage with a lot of different scholars and lay persons and more advanced amateurs, a wide spectrum. And then of course, trolls and racists, they all come together, online to have these intellectual battles, especially concerning the identity of the ancient Egyptians. That seems to be the hot topic, for I don't know how many years or whatnot. So on the panel right now, I have three gentlemen who are also members of the EgyptSearch.com forum. And so they have agreed to come on this panel and discuss a variety of topics of their interest and expertise. concerning, ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, their identification, the kind of the latest scholarship on these on this subject. And to kind of lead off, we'll probably, I'll ask them questions concerning our recent two interviews with Dr. Shamarka Keita, biological anthropologist, and his commentary, and then we can, go from there. So on the panel, I have, and I don't even know how to pronounce that correctly, but I'm gonna try. Beyoku, Brother Beyoku. We have it says 42, but he normally goes by 42 tribes. And then I don't know if this is STRO or do you want to say Stro? And so what I'm gonna do is just in that order in which I named it, y'all can kind of introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourself, what y'all main interests are, and then we'll get into the program. So starting with you, Beyoku.
Beyoku it is. I joined Egypt Search probably actually, let me see. Officially registered 2007. I was probably lurking in about maybe 2004. I got interested in Africana probably around the time I took my first trip to Ethiopia in 2005. I've since been back to Africa 3 additional times. I'm actually supposed to be there now, if not for COVID-19. And my main interest shifted from Egyptology to more anthropology to more history and genetics. And I don't know, I do a lot of reading. I like to say I've read thousands of articles, probably. I mean, you have to.
Yeah.
To really know, you have to read, a lot of stuff over years and years and years. And you could go into your computer, open up a folder where you download your stuff, and you have, 5,000 items, and you've probably read them all. You watch a lot of videos. You pay a lot of money for a lot of books, and it's just, the knowledge you acquire over time. That's basically it.
All right, 42. And before you go, thank you, Ramesu, for your donation and contribution to the channel. It is greatly appreciated. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I picked up on Egypt Search around 2013, probably. And the reason why is I was studying ancient history for a pen and paper game. And that transitioned to a movie script once I got to ancient Egypt and saw that it was just more interesting. There was more to it than I knew about. It was more African than I knew about on a cultural level. Like I always knew that there was sort of a two-faced approach to it in the media. And my first video pointed that out, where I was showing that where you would have sculptures of people and there'd be different versions where some of the versions had stronger African features, and those would be, you'd have to do a Google search for that, maybe an extra search for those, where with the other ones, they were on Front Street. And that was across the board, damn near every major figure. And you could break it down to, I forget the woman's name who used to do the real, like, detailed artwork that looks more modern, where it's just like you'll see Narmer, it'll be like some white dude, where it'll look like the Narmer palette, but he'll have the crown of Upper Egypt and everything. And this woman did that for like everybody, and that was across the board. So I knew stuff like that was going on, but I didn't know how deep the rabbit hole was, and I was somewhat shocked that it was still going on because I had been asleep to that. Like I was into other things and maybe more obvious in your face forms of racism, not so much that Egypt is presented two-faced, and it's not just like what you'll see in libraries or most of the selected pictures. There's some exceptions, like you can't have an article on Huni and really use anything else but that one picture. But if you have the opportunity to use like a different Ramses III or Ramses II, you'll see one image that's more the images where the features are just more general are more common. But even getting into that, and I guess in this kind of reminds me of what Bioko was saying, that in the sense of transition more into studying population genetics and just curiosity when it comes to that. And some things stand out in the other direction, where I'm seeing just how indigenous some of these features are in Africa. And there's other things to beyond that, but I think I'll pass it on to Stro.
All right. And how do you pronounce it? Just Stro?
Yeah, you can just say Stro.
Okay.
I'm actually El Maestro on
Okay,
ES.
Maestro. Okay.
I'm rather new compared to everybody else here. Started around 2014. My journey actually started with Egypt Search because of, college. I had a art history class. And one of the biggest things they asked us about was, Egypt, right? So every time I'd browse the web and search, Egypt Search kept popping up with details about, Egypt. Egypt Search kept. So I was just like reading and seeing the fact that we had African Black people who were doing research and uploading information and whatever. And I figured if I'm gonna keep looking and taking information from the site, I might as well join, My background is actually biology. I wasn't really into history until I started my ES days. And I realized like around that 2014, a lot of the genetics and stuff were becoming very, well, I knew it was a thing back in the days, but I knew there was a lot of discussion about, I believe that's the year when the Natufian paper dropped and everything, right? So there was a lot of interesting genetic discussions going on. And me with my background, I've seen a lot of incorrect preconceived notions, or a lot of inaccurate ways of looking at things, from just a biological point of view and not necessarily a historical one. So I said, I figure I might as well join and try to, as a Black person, try to help guide our people, or people like me who are doing the same thing, into like thinking about things the right way, or a better way, or more acceptable way in the mainstream education, and then from there, I actually just became really addicted to doing research and reading, and like I have thousands and thousands of articles now. And then I started getting into history. Before, I didn't have an interest in it because I wasn't learning about, me and us. But now I developed the interest in history, African history primarily, and here I am now, moderator on ES, So.
All right. I appreciate all of you for joining this discussion. And like y'all, my path is a little different because, I got into this really in the mid and late 90s in the heat of the Martin Banal debates and things of that nature. And so like one of the early listservs that I was a part of course, was the HarperCollins listserv, where Mary Lefkowitz and Martin Banal actually had a debate, online. And from there, other subsequent, listservs started, like the Tassetti listserv. And then, of course, the Nile Valley listserv started by our brother, Robin Walker, where they continued these debates. And so for me, I went more the linguistic route in trying to understand the language and the culture and the mind of the people and who they clustered with that. And so like the genetics and all of that kind of stuff came, way later. I was more concerned with learning the hieroglyphs to be able to read what they said themselves, and then, go the route of like Theophilo Benga and Diop in terms of the language affinities. And so, so usually my contributions, even on Egypt Search, has to deal with the language perspective. But just to kick things off, so I assume that y'all caught one or both of the Shamarka Keita interviews on this channel. So, you know, what were y'all opinions, you know, saying of the interview in terms of, you know, what he brought about, and what do you wish, you know, was talked about but wasn't, you know, given the time frame and things. So anyone, y'all can jump in.
I actually enjoyed listening to him speak. To be short, I feel like he was introducing a lot of concepts that could have been delved deeper into. But it seemed very in his presentation of what he knows, it was very I don't think it was entry level, to say the least. I think that he said a lot of things that were actually pretty deep, especially within the field of like biology. I hope that we continue that discussion today, or continue some of the things that he touched upon today. But overall, I enjoyed it. Having people like that, and the other linguists I've seen that you've had in your panels before, I think it's a very good thing you're doing for the community, you know?
All right. So, appreciate it. Go ahead.
I enjoyed it. I like a lot of. I actually met him in. I can't say the year. Maybe it was 6 or 7 years ago. They had a genetic conference in Chapel Hill, African specific, and you know I'm that deep in the hobby that I traveled to North Carolina and was one of the few lay people there. It was, you know, hardcore academics, you know, professors and whatnot. And here I am over in the corner, you know, taking notes, but it was good. And, you know, you see the people face to face and all the researchers, and you like, for me, as a person that's not too interested in sports, those were like the superstars to me, you know, the real heavyweights. And I'm just like, wow. Yeah, I read all your work. Yeah, you know, I'm just pointing them out in the room. But I was able to talk to him, and, you know, and like the one-on-one, you get like just inside information and concepts that you just don't see. You know, personal communication back and forth. I actually talked to Chris Ferrara too. It was maybe 10 minutes, and I had recently purchased his book, and so I was able to just like pick his brain, like, what about this? What about this? What about this? And, you know, it's to me, Keita is like, I don't personally know him that well, so he's not really a mentor, but he's just like an idol. And the way he thinks, like, it gets to the point where like all the racial baggage is kind of like pushed off to the side, because the information that you're learning is much more important than just figure out, you know, oh, that person is black, that person is black. I mean, you already know that part. That's like the least important part. They're brown skinned. Like if you go there today, it's people there that's brown skinned. That you're like, you know, where do I fit in? You know, when I took a DNA test, maybe it was over 10 years ago when 23andMe was like hot. Yeah. You don't get the narrative that Europeans get. They can, you know, they have it. Oh, Bell Beaker this, your steep ancestors, and, you know, farmers. They got the whole nine built in. Once they just click on their lineage and see everything going back 10 or 12,000 years. But for us, Africans, it's like slavery, Bantu. And you have to do the West. You know, even like the maps. Yeah. You have to do a whole bunch of digging just to see where your people fit in. And, you know, a whole lot of reading. And so every time I hear Keita, when he gives like a speech or something, I always want to hear it.
All right, 42.
Yeah, one thing that stood out was he talked about how you have genetic differences in your own family, and that stood out because we, in population genetics, we're thinking in terms of modern populations, different ethnic groups, and that's true. Like across the board, we share so much that you can have a gene for gout way across on another continent that you share with somebody else, et cetera. And that stood out. I wanted to keep picking his mind. Like the one thing I wanted to see if he had any information on the alternative theories when it comes to Neanderthal admixture, because it seems like if you look at that last, I don't know if I would say, I guess maybe it works. Like maybe I should share my screen, because for it was January 30th, where it said that there was a report saying Africans carry a surprising amount of Neanderthal DNA, and they were still pinning that on admixture from people who left Africa and came back. And I wanted to see what he thought about that, because there's a bunch of issues with that I have. But one thing that I'm just thinking about right now is that it pushes the date in which people would have left Africa back further, which corresponds with what he was talking about how we share genes to the point where you have people in one family that have like the gout example, but it's not just that. Like it could just be buck teeth. We're across the board, and it goes back to the animal kingdom with some of the genes we share. So that's something I wish could have been explored a little bit more. Because looking at this article, maybe I should put this in the chat. Because it says it's basing the spread from Africa. It's pushing it to 70,000 years to fit in admixture. To some degree, I think that's how they're wording it. I might be presumptuous, but I need to read it again. But that's the vibe I've seen on other studies, that to fit Neanderthal admixture, we have to, and actually I think Strolla talked about that in one of the studies where they found DO. So I think that's how people remember that study. So that's something I'd like to explore, and that just reminded me of how it's not just that example with when he talks about the genetic differences within one family, but I think having studied anthropology to the level that Keita has, he's seen that sort of Giuseppe Sergei Klein of skull features live. Like he's actually seen it in ways that I haven't. Like that's something I'm kind of weak on is anthropology. I don't study that near. Like I read a lot of population genetic studies and stuff like that. Read a bunch of Wikipedia and what links I can find there. But I'm not that strong with anthropology. But like that's an area where Keita has a broader scope. So he's seen the relationship and the decline with North Africa and probably the Sahel, Southern Europe, Central Africa, and maybe areas where it breaks the climb.
Yeah, Keita is sitting on a wealth of information, and knowing him personally, and even the stuff that he shared with me, I guess which is one of the benefits of having that relationship. And in the private conversations, and to really go beyond what you see on the very few, because it's not really that many online interviews or presentations by him. So I think it's really kind of two other videos online, one at Manchester, and I forgot what the other one is. And then there's one that I posted from the DOP conference. It's a very, very brief clip. And then, of course, the two interviews that I did of him. But there's not much. And I think there's like one more. There's one more. There's a short clip from a little documentary that one of the museum, I think the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, did. And he's having a brief discussion on Nubia. But outside of that, you're not going to see too much conversation, with him, at least online. So it's really a blessing to be able to have these particular conversations with him. So me and him will debate on the validity of Afroasiatic, and so I have to educate him on the finer details of linguistics and why that is problematic for various reasons, and trying to link genetics and linguistics. But he knows that much, but he goes with the Afroasiatic because that's the consensus. So he just sticks with that. But he's mainly focused on the skulls and the genetics and things of that nature. But as far as like at least on Egypt Search recently, concerning that conversation, there's another individual who is still harping on the Abusir study. And what is y'all take on that study and his response to it?
His response to it was actually appropriate. It was a sensationalist article. It wasn't very telling given the sample set, the location where they got the samples from, and it wasn't very forthcoming about the results in terms of how they relate to people within Africa and outside of Africa. As I was trying to say before, I'm not trying to get too deep too early, but as I said before on ES, I took the time out of my day or my days. It took a while to get this done, but to remap the three with autosomal data, remap them, and pull out their SMP profile, and also run FSTs, which wasn't done in the actual study. It was supposed to be a comprehensive study. And I found, to me, it felt rather alarming that you would have like negative FST values when comparing them to certain populations, which is something I believe should be mentioned, whether or not it's high coverage data or not.
Hold on, before you continue.
Yeah.
There are a lot of non-EgyptSearch.com viewers who don't know anything about STRs and things of that nature. So if you can kind of explain a little bit of that, while you're talking and moving forward, that'll be great.
All right, I'm sorry about that. All right, so what will happen is when you look at a comprehensive paper revolving around genetics, usually when you are introduced to samples for the first time, what they will do is they'll take all of the data that they have collected in terms of like their genes, in terms of SNPs, which are like just one nucleotide, one base pair. Like if you know DNA, they're just a change in one base pair. Or how simple should I make it?
As simple as possible. You don't have to give a full, but just give it. In other words, when you say the words, give it just some context and what it means in the data, and then And so so I encourage y'all, when y'all hear these terms, write it down and look it up, after the show. Okay,
so we will take a selection of SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are a mutation amongst a single base pair, right? And you create like a profile for these samples, right? And what you would do is you would collectively compare their similarities to a data set, which is a bunch of other samples, right? And what you would get is one of the ways you can do that is by using pairwise FST, right? It's just, long story short, you're just comparing those groups of mutations to the groups of mutations of a bunch of other populations. And you would get, usually it's from 0 to 1. And 1 will be 100% one will be the farthest. Okay, the closer you are to a population, the closer your number will be to 0. Okay, and in some odd cases, you can get negative values, which is very rare. When you get a negative value, it means that you're comparing people who might be related to each other. You understand? It's very rare that you get that. The program that they use to run the FSTs, in the manual, it states that a negative score can be treated as 0, essentially, which means that you're comparing the same people. I don't know if that's as simple as I could make it off the top. So when I took my time out to actually run these samples under FST, because I've created an African data set, which some people might have known, which uses the most amount of African samples that you can find on the web. All right, I've created that back in about 2016, I believe. So I compared them to Africans and also ancient Near Easterners and so on and so forth. I found that they had a negative FST score with the Jordanians, I believe, the Bronze Age Jordanians from the Levant. And I found that's very weird. Why would you omit that from your data? But have a sensationalist title saying that the ancient Egyptians were less sub-Saharan African, etc., etc. Why would you omit that? With the implications of that are pretty big once you consider that you're looking at a site which have exploded like directly before these samples were buried. In terms of population size, many people could attest to this, that this was an area that was underpopulated, that expanded, probably due to foreigners coming into the site from the area of which these samples actually share the majority of their DNA in terms of SMP. To which these people share the majority of their DNA. So it's very weird that you're looking at Jordan and the Levant during the Bronze Age. These people literally preceded the dating on the Abu-Sir samples, and they're essentially the same. The Abu-Sir samples are a slightly bit more African, but they're essentially the same. And this information does not get presented. We do not get the names of the samples. We do not get any information about the burials of the samples. It was very, very weird. But I've seen posts on Egypt Search talking about these samples are Great Lake Africans, or they're actually Africans, and etc., etc. To each his own in that regard, but as far as I've looked, I can tell you, and nobody else have looked at this, and nobody else has reported it, that these people were very, 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 very similar, almost 1-to-1, except for a slight bit more African than the Bronze Age Jordanian samples, or the Levant Bronze Age samples coined by Lazarus in 2016, I believe.
Which would make sense given the fact that one of the things that I noticed about the article, and I think Keita pointed this out, is that it lacks historical context. And so when you have these what we would consider foreign DNA, there's a wide variety of reasons why that could be there, why they could be there. And so, we know that they have traded with the Levant since the 4th millennium BCE. And there's archaeological evidence showing that the Egyptians had colonies in the Levant in the 4th millennium BCE, and also people from the Levant would come into the Delta region and settle and become Egyptianized, which is, we could tell by the wares, and this is something that I discuss in the last chapter of the book I recently released. And so you have that component. Then you have the component of just prisoners of war, who have been brought in, you know, and then, you know, so you have regular trade, people migrating in and out. You have prisoners of war, and you also have, as Keita remarked, that not too far from there you have a weaver's town. And if for anybody who knows, you know, saying about ancient Kemet, there's a period in its history where it's kind of like how we outsource a lot of stuff to China. They would outsource their textile industry to these women weavers out in the Levant. And so people got to understand, like, if you know, wonder why the Jews and all of these people run the garment district, you know, in New York and in other places in the garment industries, they've been doing that. They've been had a monopoly. That's been their specialty for thousands of years. And so the Egyptians used to import these women, who, you know, saying to create these textiles, you know, saying to trade and sell all across the Nile. And so, you know, of course, with those women coming in, some settle, but they also had just, you know, what we would consider Chinatowns in Egypt, in the same way that when you go to New York or San Francisco, in these places, that they have these, you know, we say Chinatown as if all of them come from China, but we know that these East Asians cluster in major cities, you know, and build up their own. So you had those in Egypt themselves. So without this historical context, you know, and then to sensationalize like the Egyptians, you know, cluster with these people in the quote unquote Near East, it is very misleading and disingenuous, as far as the data. So, Biyoku, you have any thoughts?
Not too many. One thing I don't like that they do with these studies is I think they include too many population that sort of eats up the diversity. So you have you know, Native Americans in there, Alaskans, Papuans, Japanese, Chinese, you know, Vietnamese. You have all these people, and I don't. It gets to the point where some of the diversity that may be pushed into certain African components gets eaten up by worldwide populations that probably have no, you know, nothing to do with ancient Egypt. So why you even have them there? I can name some European studies, and when they do their ancient DNA, they don't have any Africans in there. You know, so they don't even have North Africans in there. So, you know, not only, like, one thing I say about the Seder, we don't even know how North African they were because there was no North African cluster. Like what are y'all doing? So, I mean, I saw it, I read it. It sort of is what it is.
Yeah,
I
agree.
You know, it's. I would have liked to see the Y DNA. At least, you know, we would have. Like, I asked people, what if the Y DNA was as African as the maternal lineages? Then what do we do? When haplogroup A, B, and C is just like, you know, 4%. Then you're like, oh, okay, yeah. Then you sort of know. And unless you wanted to say, well, those are the real Egyptians, and all the native, you know, M35, M78, all that stuff is new from Equatorial Africa. They don't want to say that. So, you know, it's kind of like, I read the study, but I wasn't satisfied. You know, even how they do like the African components, you know, Ethiopians are not a combination of Levantines and Yoruba. That's not it. That's not it. So I don't know. It was weak. It was weak. They looking for, a lot of these studies is like they're looking for themselves in African samples, and it's not really about the Africans. You know, I can get the other North African sample. It was more about the Neolithic migrant that wasn't from Africa compared to the older North African samples they had. Like, oh, we don't want to know about those old guys. We want to know about the new guy that's the farmer. Like, I
Yeah,
kind of know what they're gonna do, but you just sort of take the meat and leave the bones. You take the meat and leave the bones.
I agree. It seems like they had introduced just enough information so that they can produce that sensationalist title, and anything else that can throw that out of whack was just omitted. Like no Y DNA and no explanations, no pairwise FSTs, no, just as long as they can create that title or that narrative that people will read the paper and leave with. They just added information just to create that narrative. Nope, not too much to the left, not too much to the right. Because if you make them too non-African, then people are going to say, hey, these people might be foreigners. Or if you make them too African, then you won't be able to say, hey, these people weren't so-and-so before Africans came in. It was like they fenced it in that particular paper. I mean, they can do it. They can do it. Can't really get upset. They at least uploaded the samples so that we can take a look at them ourselves. But it's not like it doesn't say anything, right? Yeah. About Egypt. It is comprehensive data on the site itself for spanning about 1,000 years, I believe. So it does say something, but in terms of how they presented the data, it was very in the middle, like very safe in order to get out the narrative that these people weren't as African as people think they are, which was the narrative I believe that they were trying to go for.
It was also a tiny sample size when it came to the full genomes. Like they had a bunch of haplogroups, so they were testing a bunch of people. But then when you get to the full genomes, I think it was 4 people. So, and then those 4 were more recent. But even then, I've changed somewhat on Abu Sir, at least as far as autosomal lineages, in the sense that I could picture those being mostly indigenous. But that doesn't mean they didn't select it because it was a metropolitan area, because I think what we're talking about is just the face of white supremacist propaganda. Let's take this area and describe it as a place that had so little sub-Saharan African that we could say it increased over time and put that on the headlines. That's what it really presented to you. But the reason why I say it's difficult to say to what extent it could be more indigenous is because we didn't get the names of the people, and we had such a small sample size. So on a larger scale, all you had were a bunch of lineages. You didn't really get anything to compare them to. But I did have a question for Stro. And when you compared them to your database, didn't they show that they were heavily related to, I think, like the Bedouin and the Hinido, I can't even pronounce their names, Sudanese?
In my last I believe the last big admixture chart that I posted, they were comparable, but I think I denoted that you should compare them to other outside populations and how they're comparable as well, including the Jordanians and as well as the Israel. I believe there's 2 samples in that data set from Israel during the Bronze Age. They showed very similar population clusters, like to those populations. And the reason why I told you to look at it is because that admixture chart showed is a premature one, but it is a Northeast African component, which you don't necessarily see when looking at admixture charts, right? You usually never really see Northeast Africa for context. You usually either see this person is Near Easterner or this person is Sub-Saharan African, right? In that chart, you get like it's not a gradient; it's an actual Northeast African component. And as you can see, it peaks in Northeast Africa and it and it gets lower in neighboring areas. And I wanted you to look at the Abu Sir mummies. They have the Northeast African component, but they also, well, so do the Bronze Age Israelis, so do the Bronze Age Jordanians, right? And they have them at comparable frequencies. You understand? So they fit in on that gradient, but there were non-African populations who showed more African related components than the Abu Sir 3. You understand? You had a late, I believe he was in Rome. He was of the Roman Empire. I forgot the actual site where he was found, but you have a late sample from Rome who showed a higher amount of African-related ancestry than the Abu Sir samples. You understand? It clustered as an outlier. You even had the Natufians who kind of showed more of African-related correspondence. So you got to look at these things like holistically, like comparatively. You understand? So that's what I have to say about that. And moving on to the STRs, I would warn against. Saying that the STRs were purposefully removed, because it probably isn't true. I remember Bioku asked for it a few years back, and I said, yeah, you can probably extract the STR from the BAM file kit. And I tried, and I came back and I said, okay, they weren't there. I didn't say that they were purposefully removed. I didn't say that they were purposefully omitted. Okay, I did not say why they weren't. I said they weren't there. Okay, but you got to remember, these are old samples, right? And how they sequence these guys, they take small stretches of DNA, and then they try to map them together using a reference panel. You get what I'm saying? So they take very, very small fragments, and they just add them up and add them up and add them up. And based on the quality of the calls, they remove some, and then it goes through a whole bunch of quality checks before they get to the point where they say, we have a whole autosomal profile for this particular person. You understand? So short tandem repeats, STRs, they're prone to breaking or being shortened. You understand? Because it's a long stretch of DNA containing repeated sequences. You understand? If you're looking at ancient DNA, chances are you're going to get damaged STRs. You understand? You're going to get damaged microsites because that's a long stretch of DNA. You understand? So I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they were purposefully removed or they were purposefully hidden. And I'm not going to defend them because I don't know. I honestly do not know what happened. But I would warn against saying that they were purposefully omitted or purposefully removed, because that just probably might not be true. You understand? And there's no reason to fabricate anything in order to fit our own narrative. It would be just as bad as whoever else we're accusing of doing anything. So
I guess that goes to like I'm a methods person. Like, regardless of what your conclusion is, I want to know how you got there. And there's, a lot of folks who like to make arguments, but don't know these little things, like what you just mentioned, that would go to an issue of methods and what you should consider when you're analyzing the data. And they'll come to conclusions and make certain allegations without any justification, and I always stress to caution side on, or be on the side of caution, when you're analyzing these things and coming to these conclusions and understanding more so than anything what's the proper methodology. Like for me, this is just how I personally do it. Before I get into a subject that requires me to know a lot of things, I purchase books on the methodology in that field, so I can get a good sense of how would professionals in this field judge the data. what is their care and concern, going through the scientific methods or the scientific process, using the scientific method in their experimentations. And in that way, when I'm reading the material, I know what to look for in terms of what was done and what was not done. And this is, even when I'm speaking to Keita and we're talking about Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, and all this other kind of stuff, like if you understand linguistic methods and you know that, like Bioku mentioned Christopher Ehret earlier, like no matter how many texts you get of Christopher Ehret, you would never find a text from him where he comes to a conclusion on Afro-Asiatic using the historical comparative method, which is the scientific method for linguistics. And you have to ask these questions. Well, how did you come to this conclusion that these people are related if you haven't gone through a process that eliminates chance as a reason for your conclusions? And I see the same thing, here, and why the historical component, as far as the Abusir paper is concerned, and for me, it's just an issue of methods. Like there's just certain things that you can just tell that they did not consider, and it has major implications, for their conclusions. And so they kind of save face by saying, well, if we would have sampled further south, we would expect more, African, DNA, what they consider African DNA. But this goes now to the question of, in terms of how do you properly identify an ancient Egyptian body? Like what constitutes, like, an ancient Egyptian DNA sequence? Like you would have to have a lot more samples from all across, especially in the older samples. And so we know the further back in time you go, the harder it is to extract, DNA and things. But they just totally ignore like Badarian, data, information from Tasseti, the Western Desert, and all of this, which indicates that, at minimum, the ruling class comes from the South. And so, if you wanted to find out who the ancient Egyptians were, wouldn't you have to go to these southern regions and do, your DNA testing from different, places? So you get 3 samples from one site in a particular time period, which we know there's a flux of Europeans and Asians coming into Egypt and settling. It's very disingenuous, given the history. But to switch it up a bit, what is y'all take on the famous, and I guess now debunked company, the 42 tribes, analysis of the Ramesses III and Armana, mummies, which argue that they cluster more so with folks in Central and Southern Africa. What is y'all take?
I can jump in.
I'll go last.
I one thing real quick, because a lot of, and thankfully it has been covered with DNA tribes. One thing, there were studies before DNA tribes that weren't released, at least 2. You know what I mean? And at least, I don't know, there might be more. And that goes into how the Abusir presentation was problematic, because it was presented as the first. Like, bam, we have, for the first time, ancient Egyptian DNA. And then you have DNA tribes was like a few years before that, and they're acting like it doesn't exist. So that's problematic. The thing I like about the DNA tribes test was that people did a lot of work on those, and they were able to validate them. I mean, but they came validated because they used these same samples for for like Time magazine to show that King Tut was the son of Akhenaten, and they are showing these exact same STRs that you can put on Pop STR and everything. The one thing that maybe people haven't mentioned that I wanted to bring up with the DNA tribes test is that you also have the not the MLI score, and you also have the separate tribe score that came with them. And the tribe score was interesting because they seem to be stronger in the Horn with that score, but with the MLI score, they were stronger in the South and Central Africa and even West Africa compared to the Horn. And I think the reason why that is that Horn ancestry is so universal that that like the Armana family and Ramses' son, they were similar to Horners in the sense that they had some SDRs that might have been more diverse as far as being more Mediterranean related to people outside Africa. And that might have boosted their tribe scores in that respect. But the MLI score, I think it factored exclusivity more. So supposedly, and this is like from the work for people in Egypt Search who did this, like especially Tukler and Swinnet, is they had STRs that are exclusive with Batswa and Khoisan, and combinations that are exclusive with people. I think Bioko mentioned that with the Karamojong and Somali. So having those exclusive markers boosted them in those areas where those people live. So I think that's one reason they were boosted there. But they also had some frequent Bantu markers thrown in there, you know. So it was Smorgasbord Africa to some extent. But that's it.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay, I'm pretty sure Bioko can
I'll let you go first. Go ahead.
I'm gonna just talk about I'm gonna talk briefly about the Y DNA about Ramses, because that was mentioned during the Keita interview. Him being EM2. And I believe somebody attempted to ask a question about how does Ramses being EM2 and EM2 not being found in northeastern Cameroon, how does that affect the genesis of EM2? I believe that's the question the person was trying to ask. And I actually think in retrospect, I think it was a good question because, okay, the issue with the Ramses, with the Ramses call is that there's a chance that he could not have been EM2, right? And it's because of one, they say it might be contamination why he ended up being EM2, but it's because of I believe one base pair, which is what separates him from being EM2 or
V22 was it?
Or EV22, yeah. So I would say this: it's very unlikely that you'd have the same, because there's two people who were sampled. I believe Ramses and I believe they said it was his son, right? But he was he wasn't labeled up. Yeah.
Unknown man E.
Unknown man E. So it's very odd that you would get the same reads or the same calls twice, and it'd be inaccuracy. You understand? So. So I'm still on the fence about that, but it doesn't matter to me. EV22 or EM2, he could be either. But in terms of the question that person had asked, in terms of Cameroon, that was supposed to be the Bantu homeland, right? And the census was as late as 3,000 years ago, I believe, and there was no EM2 there. You understand? So I'm guessing this person was trying to lead on to the idea that EM2 was probably somewhere more north. Whether in the Sahara or because based on a study that came out before, people of the Green Sahara, where they released a whole bunch of YDNA information, you've seen that EM2 had some upstream and some unique clades that were dispersed amongst North Africa. And those who were of the Bantu expansion had subclade, like daughter clades and subclades that were much younger. They dispersed much younger. The coalescent states were like 800 years ago, 1,000, 1,200 years ago. They were much younger. So I guess that's where they were going. But that's all I'm gonna talk about in regards to the DNA tribes paper, the EM2. The EM2 calls for Ramses.
I'll chime in. I was able to do a little personal communication with the founder of DNA Tribes, and when the first one came out, and they did that, when the second data came out, I was like, "Yo, guys, you should what was it, Martin Lucas, whatever his name was, like, it's another report, some more mummies. You should go ahead and make another one of those digest articles." And they did. And there's actually a few more. There was, I want to say, one mummy, the Belgrade mummy. I'm just searching around. I found another STR profile, sent it to those guys. But by then, I guess he had passed away and nothing really happened with it. They have Napoleon. His SDR profile is out there. There are mummies from, I think, like some Scandinavian mummies. Their SDR profiles are out there. So you can, I was sort of using those as like tests just to see, okay, how bogus is it? Let me run Napoleon, see if he comes up African. Of course, he doesn't. He comes up as you would expect. So the SDR profile is African, but I argued a bunch of times that it's extinct going by the MLI scores. And when I say extinct, I mean like the genetic profile of an ancient Egyptian no longer exists. So think of us. I'm African American. At the higher end of African ancestry, probably 88, 89% Sub-Saharan, 10% European. After 2,000 years, I could be, 12% African. I'll still consider, my people will still be, we're African American. We came during, 2,000 years ago, blah, blah, blah. But the profile of an African American, that doesn't exist anymore. And you may find it in Africa somewhere, because maybe, over 2,000 years, they haven't been mixing like New World populations have. And so with that data, when you look at those MLI scores, they basically describe how many times more likely you are to be related to X population than anywhere in the world. So if the score is 100, you're 100%, 100 times more likely to be related to this group than that group. If it's 1,000, then it's 1,000. The MLL scores for the mummies were really, really, really low. Some of them in the single digits. When I take a DNA tribes test, the results it gives you for West Africa and West Central Africa are in the millions. So me, it's like I'm 1 billion times more related to a Nigerian than any of these mummies are related to any place in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's how low those numbers are. And the numbers are so low, it's like I'm more related to a Scandinavian than some of these mummies are, or more related to like an Eskimo. And with the numbers that low, and when I say Eskimo, I mean like literally, like the number for an Eskimo with me would be 15, but then one of the mummy scores with, West Africa is 8. It gives you information that's not that useful. It tells you they're African, but you really can't pinpoint exactly what's going on. Also, what it means. Their algorithm is also proprietary, so, and they don't even exist anymore. So what do you do with that? There were test results like with a European, and it's like a European score will be, closer to the Horn of Africa than some of the mummies are with the Horn of Africa. And how does that make logical sense? There are no genomes like a modern day European in the Horn of Africa as a native variant. It doesn't really exist. So that's why I said like the profile, and when you understand what an STR profile is, it's not like a SNP. SNP changes over long series of time. STR is like something real specific, which tells you if if your male ancestor is from Somalia, haplogroup T, or if he's from Thomas Jefferson, haplogroup T. It's changing that fast. So with a profile that's changing that fast, here we are 3,000 years later. Of course, it's non-existent. So, you can use it. Data is data. It's good data, but you just can't see it, like literally as people. Bantu people weren't even in South Africa during the time that those mummies were there. So, it's only certain ways you could view that data. And I think we kind of like got ahead of ourselves, and been talking about it for like 10 years.
Now, when it comes to that, I think that there, and I discussed that component recently on one of my recent conversations, concerning migrations. And so, like, even though, because we got to remember that even in the Ramesses, in that DNA tribe study, they're comparing to modern populations in their modern setting. And so, what stood out to me, regardless of what, saying the issues were, is that you do not see like at least for those mummies, it's not indicative of population, but at least for those mummies, they did not cluster well with anyone in the Sudan or anyone in the Horn. And you hear these stories of migrations of these people coming from, coming down south in these areas. So like people like the collagen who kind of surround the Great Lakes area. And so they have oral traditions that they were once in ancient Kemet. And we have enough evidence to say that this isn't something that was made up because they read an Egyptology book, so to speak. Because if you know about African cultures, just like how we mentioned earlier with the women weavers coming out of the Levant, these Asian women weavers, crafts were kind of relegated to whole ethnic groups. So you like when we think of the United States Army, for example, we know at least now that it's more so about citizenship, in terms of being in the Army, and any kind of, ethnic and racial, saying profile is almost kind of irrelevant because everyone is mixed in all kind of brigades, whether they Navy SEALs, Special Ops, or just regular Army, Air Force, whatever. They're all kind of mixed in. But that's not the case in traditional indigenous Africa. Certain groups, that's what their whole clan, their whole population, that's what they were involved in. So you have, for example, like the Magi aspect of the military of ancient Kemet. Then you have the Sabani people, who were the proto-Calajan, folks. And so when they leave in terms of a whole cluster and migrate in mass, regardless to how the population size is. So to me, it makes sense given the known history of these groups of people who migrated through the Sudan into the Great Lakes region, and some going further down south, and of course intermingling with Bantu and Cushitic speakers and this over the years. So we got to remember, from the time that Egypt fell, this is over 2,000 years ago. And so like even in my latest book, I talk about how the different reasons for migrations over time that you'll find just around the world in general. So of course, people escaping natural disasters, people escaping war, people escaping droughts, and then of course trade. And so you have all of this going on all throughout ancient Egypt's history. And we have evidence of, it could be families, just a small village of families that'll move. Like, how does that change the DNA profile going into the future. And so this doesn't take thousands of years. I give an example in the text of this one group who comes from South Africa, who it was a whole village that moved 1,500 miles north into Malawi. It only took them about 5 or 6 years. So when we think about like Mansa Musa on the west coast of Africa, who had a whole entourage and they walked all the way to Mecca, you know, to do a pilgrimage and back in the same year, you know. And so these people migrating, you know, all up and down the aisle. We have evidence, you know, of trade going as far down as Mozambique with ancient Egypt and the Middle East, and materials coming from Mozambique and Madagascar in during pharaonic times. So it doesn't surprise me at all when I see what we saw in the DNA tribes, you know, in terms of the particular profiles. And then, of course, you know, with me with the language study, there's indications in the language that there were Bantu speaking people in Egypt. And I know that's kind of hard, you know, for a lot of people to wrap their head around because of the narrative, you know, and the way that Greenberg has divided these families together. But if you know linguistics and you know how to do an analysis on the language, you know, like ancient Egyptian is an agglutinating class language. They called themselves Bantu, just a different dialectical, you know, saying variation of it. And when you see the name of certain deities in terms of customs and things, it clusters culturally with the Bantu speaking people. So again, nothing surprised me about the DNA tribes. You know, it only reinforces on a genetic level, but I also try to separate genetics and linguistics, you know, saying in terms of culture, because it could be a situation where, you know, only that ruling class, let's just say for the sake of argument, not making this argument, but could have been Bantu speakers, just like Barack Obama is an anomaly, you know, in the United States chain of rulers. And if we just sample Barack Obama and his family, you know, it would, and gave the impression that, you know, the Americans were, you know, Kenyan and, you know, Southside Chicago, you know, with some white admixture, you know, it would be a false reality. So, but, you know, you also got to consider that, like, it could have been an anomaly that this group of pharaohs in this pocket were a particular type of people. So, you know, I always stress that there's just we need a whole bunch of samples before we can start coming to any kind of major conclusions. It's just, you know, DNA is hard to find in ancient, you know, remains, and it's so few tests that have been done. And then you got to think about the history. So, you know, when Europeans came into Egypt, you know, they were burning mummies and trading mummies, and, you know, thinking that the mummies had medicinal value, that, you know, you can resurrect from a sickness if you grind
them up, eat them.
Exactly. So, you know, what does that do to the profile, the selection of the mummies for DNA? Like, we could have had they had a better sense of respect for, you know, saying the mummies and things. Go ahead, Bayeku. I said, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Another that are not in. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, I was saying, even some of the mummies
You are breaking out.
You're breaking up now.
have.
I thought that was my sister.
You are frozen.
Yeah, you're frozen, man.
Okay, give me a second. Someone else can chime in, and I'll continue.
We can hear you good now.
Yeah.
How about now?
Yeah, I mean, I can hear you well
Okay.
now.
Shoot.
I was saying uh,
Just messed up again. Spoke too soon.
one,
You broke it up again.
one,
Frozen.
Yeah, your
they're
connection got
digging
the.
in pre-dynastic,
I don't know if you can hear us, but your connection has the
but
coronavirus.
they did it.
It's not breathing well. Like you're breaking up bad. So I don't know what's going on with that.
Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I first wanted to say, like, the DNA tribes test should be on Wikipedia still. Like, it's still out there. I've had a problem with that, but I don't know if you could really say, like, of course the genetic profile on the pure is extinct. Like, you're not gonna find any type of exact matches or with a modern population, but some of the work that Tukler at Egypt Search did showed that you do have really rare combinations in Upper Egypt and the Sudan, which contrast how much they're related by MLI scores to Central Africans and South Africans. And I think those like I said, I think those relationships are based on exclusivity. And even though the score isn't that high, hell, I had 0 Yoruba. Like any other S&P test, I never show up 0 Yoruba. When I did an DNA tribes test, it showed 0 Yoruba. And then I had, like, I was high up on people who were related to Yoruba. I was higher on Somali than Yoruba. And then, like, the other zeros, I don't think I had any other West African zeros. But then I take an S&P test, and I'm highly related to Yoruba. So I think with that score, it's based almost completely on eliminating who you're not related to, so you can, like, throw your MLI score bet, put your money on who you are related to. So that's what I'm saying. I think it's more about exclusivity, and that profile, what it showed was like I said earlier, their relationship with Karamazov. But again, it's a real test. Like, when you test ancient people, you're not going to get major hits with modern populations like that. So knowing that, you could say the same thing about practically any tests, even a full genome. Like, I think it was with Abu Sir, I've seen people who are related to them, like modern populations. I don't know about like Stroh mentioned the Bronze Age Jordanians, and I think like Chalcolithic Israelis were related to them. But with modern populations, you're not going to have that type of a strong relationship. And like with Abu Sir, like I said, I don't know with modern populations, who would you think they are most related to? Because and that was another issue I had with that test, is it compared them to ancient Turks, like the Anatolians.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's kind of unfair, because when you're squeezing the timeline, on face, who's more related to Africans than the Levant? I don't who outside of Africa is more related to Africans. So we're going to take the ancient place due north of the Levant and Egypt and compare to them, and then say, look, they're more related to these Anatolians than they are Sub-Saharan Africans. That's kind of stacked, regardless of how indigenous they might or might not have been. So, but that's at least where I'm coming from with DNA tribes. Like what Wikipedia did, they shut down everything. And this is a company that was cited by S.O.Y, and that's pretty much Wikipedia's lifeblood. Like when they predict where haplogroups came from, they always cite S.O.Y, and you'll have with S.O.Y linked, you have mutations. I don't know how long I'll have, but I have a question for everyone. I don't want to deflect or go off this subject, because I think it's a good subject, but can we save a time for questions, not just from maybe people in the chat, but I also have a question for everybody.
Yeah, ask it now.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can share my screen. Let's see. Okay. It should be sharing. Are you seeing it?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Mhm.
No.
Well, let me. I got to physically add it to the
Okay.
stream.
Bam. All right. Now I'm getting that infinity right there. Let me see what. And this was, I was researching Y chromosome, not Y chromosome, but mtDNA haplogroup I. And I had seen this before. I had even done a video on it, how it shows up strong in like Rendell and Almolo. And I pulled it from this study. So I don't know, like this isn't really segueing too well, but you can see the title of the study. And this is the raw data.
Before you can, but hold on. Before you continue, you can hide that. Don't hit the stop sharing button, but next to it it says hide at the bottom.
Cool.
Okay, there you go.
This is, let's see. I think I also have another one that has actually this has both. This has as much as the branches as you can get. So this is from that study I flashed up there earlier. And are any of you able to get that branches with these? Because I was just curious of what branch of I they had. And for a while I was wondering if maybe they were just doing branches for L. But then I looked and I see like, okay, we got HV branches, RO branches, got plenty L branches. This is some pure L3. Why are we getting like, what is this? These are modern samples. Why don't we get more branches with these? Like with I think you have like some S.O.Y person who has novel N, and they capitalize it down here somewhere over here.
Scroll all the way to the top.
Here it is. Like there it is. Like that's some S.O.Y, but see that one's capitalized, so that kind of makes sense. So I was wondering, okay, let me
Scroll to the top.
Scroll to the top. Yep. HVR. Okay, can you see it? So does that kind of show why like right here we have K1A3? Because I try to look at what actual branches they have with everything. Here we have T2. So, but when I get to I, it's just I. Like I'm not getting anything, and it's not capital, so I don't think it's like some novel I that they haven't found, or maybe it is. I don't know. Like maybe the homeland of I is in the Rendell and the Amolo. But that's the only question is there a better way to take this data and get branches with it?
It depends on the data set. I'm not really familiar with the actual data set in that study, but if you just don't have the S&Ps inside that data set, you don't have the S&Ps inside that data set. When you look at the second and third columns, the HVR columns, where it showed you the point mutations within before they defined the haplogroup, you realize that there were about like 5, 6, 4 point mutations to define the haplogroup. With those small amounts of S&Ps, you're not going to find anything specific unless you really look for it. And then you have to worry about the fact that because it looked like a lot of populations were in there. So I'm guessing that was a merged data set, which basically means that they're taking old data from another study and just merging it with new founded data, right? And which means that they won't have any novel reads on if you understand what I'm saying, they won't have any new reads. So with that being said, if the data if it's not in the data set, it's not in the data set. You understand?
I don't think it is.
Yeah, you're gonna get these very vague calls or vague haplogroup assignments. You understand?
When you scroll to the very top and it said HVR1 or hypervariable region 1, that's all you get. I didn't even see region 2. So basically the resolution is really, really low, and those specific SNPs that you get, that's all you get. And you can like run those into a predictor and boom, that's the haplogroup you get.
They only had one. They didn't have two. HVR2. Or was it
I,
just
I
one?
mean, I saw two sections, but it looked like they both said HVR1, or
Okay.
maybe just my eyesight.
There in the chat.
All right. Well, did they answer to your satisfaction? 42 tribes.
Yeah, they did.
All right. Well, I want to move on to Brother Biyoku. You mentioned prior to us going live some new studies dealing with neurotic. And I think you may have shared in, way at the beginning, the links to the particular studies. So I wanted you to kind of, give us a summary of what it's about and what is your take, on the studies.
I barely read it. Let
Uh,
me repost the link. But basically, it wasn't the let me see. It was the X group. So these are somewhat recent, 350 to 500 CE, and unfortunately, is pretty low resolution. I want to say it's extremely low, and they basically give us haplogroup L1B, L2, L3, H2, N, T1A, X, and W. That's it.
mhm.
And it's like a basic percentage, somewhat similar to the breakdown there. Let me post the study though. Unfortunately, I don't know why, we get some studies and the information is just like a trickle, and resolution wise is just weak. But this is what we get. This is what we get. There's no narrative behind it. They don't get into the history. It's just like boom, here you are. You know, it is what it is. But I'll post it in the group for people to see. And if people don't use it, I would suggest to definitely use Google Scholar. The people that put out the articles you want to see, definitely subscribe to them, and a lot of stuff will come into your inbox before anybody is talking about it. And you get on Google Scholar, start popping in keywords, and it'll be a study on ancient Egyptian DNA that nobody's talking about, nobody's seeing, and you're the first person that just search for it, and boom, it just popped up.
What are some text, if y'all can recall any, where people can get that is a good text for teaching this information so that a lot of more people can read the studies and get a better sense of what is being talked about in the studies? Because we're dealing with science here, and it's a little bit more involved. And so is there any text that the layperson could pick up so they can start really understanding the ins and out of kind of the stuff that we're talking about here today?
Ouch.
One
'Cause I
text.
know, yeah.
I have a good start. The first thing is get tested yourself. Get tested yourself. I think DNA Day passed, but 23andMe, what is it, $100 now for Ancestry? And once you at least get your own markers back, when you're reading the studies, you can sort of read it in context of where you fit in. And on 23andMe, YDNA, mtDNA, they have a lot of the sources where they post their own little mini narrative. They have it on there. So just start with those articles. Or when you're on Wikipedia reading an article, go to the bottom and all those resources, just start going through them one by one. It'll take some time. My suggestion is to download them, put them all in one folder, read it, take it out the folder. And you can sort of get a feel, it'll start to make sense. And email people. Email people, message boards. There are people that will hold your hand and break down exactly what is what, and where what comes from and who has what. It's just it's time consuming. It takes a lot of time. You know, I spent a lot of time reading DNA stuff when I could have been, you know, off. I'm mining crypto, or you know, I mean, I'm just thinking back on like
Yeah.
the big things that I missed, you know, because I was doing this. Like, oh, I miss, you know, I'm in IT. I missed the crypto thing,
Yeah.
you know.
So like how far removed is these type of studies from what you do in everyday real life?
Very.
Very for me at the moment, it is. I want it to not be though. You understand? I'm like in China right now, as you can see. I'm using the sunlight, so it's very far removed. The thing is about this though, is that even though like for I know especially for people who've been doing this for a long time, like Yosar, Bioku, Tukula, he's been mentioned a few times. It took a lot of time and a lot of research. You get what I'm saying? These things have become easier, but I want it to become commonplace, like this type of knowledge that we have to do so much digging and diving and backpaging, and I want this knowledge to be somewhat ubiquitous or just commonplace knowledge. The same way how you can go to school and graduate and know about Rome or the history of America growing up in the States. I think that the history of Africa and our place in the world, whether it's genetic or contribution-wise, I just think that this knowledge should just be there, right? And you understand, I don't think the things that we had to do in order to access this type of information or understand this information or grasp this type of information, I don't think anybody should have to navigate so far away from their daily lives in order to figure out or find out more about their own history or their people. You understand? And that's kind of why I'm doing this as well, in order to relay this information to others. But it's so far removed, and all I can say is for people who want to start now is just to read one thing, and then you ask a question, and then eventually you read another thing, and then you read another, and then you ask another question, etc., etc. So that's my advice for people who want to jump in. Just think about something specific and start from there, and you'll eventually branch out.
I'm sharing on the screen now my actual 23andMe data results. So I got this early, and they've updated through the year. So when I want to say, 10 to 12 years ago, something like that, is when I first got it. And this is when the tests were like $400 or $500 to get your mitochondrial and Y chromosome ancestry tests, as well as your your health assessment, so to speak. But then there was a Biyuku mentioned the DNA day. And I just happened to be logged on, I think, Facebook on that day, and someone had shared that it was DNA day. And for that day, you could get your test for $100, all 3 tests. And so, I went and got it, and, got the results sometime later. And I think the following year, they actually on DNA day, they actually had it for free for African Americans, because they're trying to get more African American samples in the database. But yeah, it's I want to get mine done with Rick Kittle's AfricanAncestry.com to see how they would do it. But one of the good things about 23andMe is they allow you to download your raw data. And you can go to any, DNA company and get it assessed more deeply or whatnot. And so, my profile is very typical of, and so most people know my birth name, which is Harold Johnson, which you will see here. But my just kind of showing people how, okay, where, I forgot where you go for your specific. It's running kind of slower because I have, I'm running this program in the background. But okay, here it goes. So, of course, being a male, I have the opportunity to do my paternal and maternal haplogroups. And so on my paternal side, I know it's a European haplogroup. And allegedly, I share ancestry with King Louis XVI, whoever that is. But when I first got it, it was like R1, B1, a whole bunch of 1A, 1 whatever. Now it's just RM405. And, it gives you, and I'm showing this so that, people can understand what Bayoku was saying in terms of they give you a bit of the history of the haplogroups, and they try to simplify it for you in terms of mapping and origins. And you see right here, it says see references. And, they'll give you the list of the studies. So this is a source of studies that you can read that'll give you some insight into the particular haplogroup that is associated with you. So, on this, the paternal side, this is, the history and things of, I got this touch screen. So so the RM405, this is, allegedly 10,000 years in terms of this particular haplogroup, which I guess we can get into as well as far as the dating of these things. Like, how do we, really assess, the identity of a people for, haplogroups that are like 10,000 years when, for example, let's say ancient Egypt as a political entity is only, 5,000 years ago, and what does that mean in terms of trying to connect a genetic, a biogenesis with a political and social, identity, saying sometime later. So this is my maternal haplogroup here, L3E2A1B. And so the details that I got about this is that these people were basically in Madagascar and Mozambique. And so when, there's a lot of us who think that we all just come from Western Africa, forgetting Central Africa and Southeast Africa. But it's in these very areas that you see these those, if we was to pull up the DNA tribe study, that those markers coincided with in terms of current population, which I found interesting. But so I'll just kind of showing this as an example. So they give you origin and migration of haplogroup L3E. They show you maps, and they have all kinds of information concerning ancestry. And then of course what is this? Order your DNA book. I might even do that. And you can also hook up with relatives. So it says scientific details for the maternal haplogroup. And I haven't been here in a while, so I know there's a lot of stuff that's changed. But then again, here it goes again, more references. So if you can hunt down those references and get more details, this is a great way to really start understanding DNA, and then you can apply your knowledge for studying yourself to any kind of ancient Egyptian, North Central, or just African bioanthropological studies to that nature. So I'll just end the screen share. And so I have no problem sharing that with the public, which I've done before. But just giving y'all some insights into how that works. But yeah, I want to see the data compared to the African ancestry, since they have the largest database alleged of African samples. And I want to get Rick Kittles. I think I'm gonna get Rick Kittles on the show as well, because I know he's published with Dr. Keita, on these issues of race in ancient Egypt before, even though his is kind of more modern. His focus is more modern, but I think since he is the geneticist, he could explain in detail what these concepts mean, and when we're looking at the data. But is there anything that y'all wanted to cover? Go ahead.
One thing, because it was mentioned on your in your interview with Dr. Keita, and that's when is something African and when is something Eurasian, or when is something Asian and when is something European. You understand? You went over haplogroups, right? For instance, you can have mitochondrial haplogroup M, and they consider it Eurasian, and it's always Eurasian. But the minute E goes into the Levant, it becomes a Levantine haplogroup, etc., and things of that nature. And it's a very that could be a conversation within itself, because that's the issue right now in academia. I don't understand how, and I don't understand why it's an issue. You would have haplogroups that spend most of its time in terms of lineage in Africa, but it's being considered Eurasian like indefinitely, like U6, M1, and that it's like me having a child, and then that child having a child in another country, and then that child comes back to this country and has two more child, but then because his grandfather was born in another country, that whole lineage is now considered. It's very, very I don't understand it. It's a disappointing way to view genetics, and it's only with Africa do you see that issue, which is why certain haplogroups become very important, which is why L3 has to have had its genesis outside of Africa, and E has to probably have had its genesis outside of Africa. We found data where we have novel N branches or off the branch within the Sahara, and we have DE in West Africa. So it's like the information is stacked up against the idea that these haplogroups are Eurasian, but it shouldn't have to come to that point. You understand? If these things spend most of its time in a particular region, then it is of that region. You understand? Whether or not it originated there or not, because as I was trying to explain to 42 Tribes, and I've also posted on Egypt Search before, the assignments themselves are arbitrary. You understand? It's nothing special that creates the letter assignment for a haplogroup. It's just a way to label the mutation as they go along. You understand? But when you label them with the letter and you assign Eurasian to it, everybody's gonna look at that like Eurasian. It's defining as Eurasian. You understand? And the minute something leaves Africa, it could be for a day, and comes back. It's non-African. It's incredible. But
Well, it seems like well, we know that there's this underlying to use 42 tribes language, European white supremacy undertone and racism under it, because the implication is that with these mutations in these other regions of the world, somehow is either the catalyst or the evidence of some kind of intellectual advancement, so to speak. So they're underlying equating the a haplogroup N or whatnot or whatever, or J marker as somehow evidence of this superior intelligence that became in this region. And so they use that as a way to try to reintroduce this notion of foreign Eurasians coming into Egypt, and then with their superior intellect was able to create the culture which created the monuments and the science and all of this other kind of stuff. And so it always ends up that they're trying to reintroduce this narrative. And so you want to say something, Bioku?
Yeah, I was just gonna like chime in where Maestro left off. They do it and they're not consistent. And when you study, I don't study European DNA. I mean, I know a little bit of it, but when you study it, you sort of see how number one, some of their major lineages are not local. R1b, haplogroup R comes from a Southeast Asian lineage, K2B2, which we're just finding that out within the last few years. Like, wow, all their diversity comes way from over there. European hunter-gatherers was almost pretty much replaced. How you look at it, they have, farmers from the Middle East, farmers from Iran, then they have getting their language from people from the Central Asian steppes, which totally erase a lot of the existing diversity. So, but of course, they just pull all that into what is European. Their Middle Eastern farmers are just European farmers. So it's weird. I kind of had this theme where I was talking about, when you're getting played, stuff like that. It's like things that they're doing. You'll read a study and you'll be like, wait, they'll say, 90% of the Y chromosomes in North Africa are Eurasian. Like, what?
How?
But 90 and they're talking about M81. Or there'd be like, X population didn't have sub-Saharan. They had 5% sub-Saharan ancestry and 10% East African ancestry. Like, well, huh?
Yeah. Well,
Somali have a hint of sub-Saharan ancestry because they, are 2% E1B1A. It's like stuff like that. They'll say things, but you have to look at the data to know when you're getting played. And a lot of times, we getting played. You'll have, again, a lineage been in Africa for 40,000 years. Let's say it back migrated 40,000 years ago. But then, V13 that's been in Europe for 5,000 years is European. It's like you gotta know, when they say stuff and you look at the data and be like, oh yeah, okay. I know when we're getting played. Basal Eurasian is Eurasian, but it's 80,000 years old, and no Eurasians exist 80,000 years ago. Like, and this is a respected author, wrote an article, what is really Africa? And basically he's talking about, substructure going back, 80, 90, 100,000 years, since it's not typical in sub-Saharan Africa now. If it was in North Africa then, it's not really African, because that was like the precursor to Eurasian. And now, since the DNA is rolling in, I always bring up the example of the ancient remains they got from China that are 45,000 years old. And of course, they are partially Native American, when of course Native Americans don't even exist because their ancestors had yet to cross the Bering Strait until, 30,000 years later. But the precursors are already there. So as you get more data out of Africa, you should expect, 70,000 years ago, data to be, on the boundary of people that are there now and people that are on the other side of the Red Sea. They have all types of fancy, Basal Eurasian. They have ANE, which links Europeans with populations all the way over in the Americas. But they are saying, you have ancient North Africans far in the Northwest, and then immediately is, Natufian and nothing in between. Like, that's it. And we know that's not the case. So, it's like a waiting game to wait on studies, because I'm not going back to school to start. I'm too old for that.
You're
so,
never too old.
And that's true. You're never too old.
That's
Let me end on
something that I wanted to, and I'm thinking about my conversations, personal conversations with Dr. Keita, and even with one of the videos that I posted of him when he came to the DIOP conference in Philly. And that's, when you think about it, Keita is really alone in the field as far as Black bioanthropologists who was doing this type of work, specifically addressing, the Nile Valley and things of that nature. And we need more people to get into bioanthropology and to be able to assess and do their own studies. Otherwise, it's just going to be, us waiting on them to do studies and then having to, break apart or deconstruct, their studies. And while I think it is a good exercise, ultimately, if we want to change or begin to change the narrative, we're going to need more professionals to actually publish and, be able to respond when they go left, like what you were just mentioning, in terms of trying to skew and the data to make it seem what it's not in reality. And this is one of the things I encourage. This is one of the reasons why a few colleagues and I, we started Black Science Month, which is October, a number of years ago, to kind of promote Blacks in science, hoping that we can encourage, even if it's not us of a certain age, who don't see themselves going back to school to be an engineer or a physician or mathematician or whatnot, that at least they can encourage their children and say, hey, this is what we need. So we need to be grooming the next generation, saying, of scholars to be able to do this type of work. And I would wish that even if, like, brothers like y'all, would write, give summaries and compile it in a book, in terms of y'all assessments, of the data and what that means up to this point, and what are we seeing, what are we not seeing, what should we be looking for, like, because y'all have accumulated a lot of data over the years, and trying to navigate through EgyptSearch.com to find threads. And then we got 100 nonsensical posts in some of the threads, at least of late, for people to navigate through that. It would be good if y'all were able to kind of outline these things in a single saying publication, and make it available to the public. I think that it would be, I'm trying to convince Dr. Keita to compile his research into a single book. Because in the academy, it's all about the journal articles. So writing books, they don't really look at that favorably, as far as tenure and things of that nature. So it's publish or perish, and so it's about, can you get your work in these pristine journals. So he has mad journal articles and chapters in books, but he has nothing himself that you can order off of Amazon, kind of outlining these things. So I'm trying to convince him, even if he doesn't do it, give it to me, I'll compile it and create the book for you. This, just sign your name and let's get it done. But I think Stro, you wanted to say something? Is he frozen? No.
He's trying to turn the mic on.
No, 42. I guess it was 42 then.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to piggy off of what Boko was saying. And I agree, Asar. Like, I think it would be cool if we did some sort of a combination, like an anthology that because I give you an example. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Right. So I had this conversation with Jehudi, and one of the things that we were talking about, and this is when they found, like, I think it was haplogroup H4 in Egypt. All right, oh shoot, I pressed the wrong one.
Yep.
Let's see. And I think it was Thebes, so it was somewhat deep in maybe 1500 BC or younger. I don't remember the exact time, but I think there's just an effort to shoehorn back migration, because like this is what I wanted to show. This is haplogroup H and HV combined. And the reason why I'm saying this, that it's shoehorned when it comes to back migration, is you see so often that the branch of these haplogroups that are outside of Africa are it's usually where the older branch, or the oldest major branch, is the one that's like homogeneous African, and that's what you see like with H1. So for back migration to have worked, RO would have came right back early enough to have its newborn daughter H1, and then if you go from RO, you do that with N, rinse repeat to L3. And that's not a pattern of back migration. That's a pattern of it diversified in Africa. And I see that with Y chromosome J. I kind of see it with R, but I mean, a lot of times we don't get which branch of K they have. So we don't know. Like Bioko was saying, we have K2, B2 in Asia. We have a whole bunch of examples of K, but we don't necessarily know what branch, because it's found. If you test a whole bunch of Africans who have R, you're going to find some K, and sometimes you find it without R. But that's the pattern that I'm seeing, and that's what I mean. It would be good to have all of that in actual work that people could reference, and like you mentioned, Asar, what could people build off of? What would people know to look for? Because what I was looking, like when I was looking at that last study, I wanted to know what branch of I. Do you see the same pattern of I? Because what I'm noticing is either you see that pattern, you don't see it, or you don't have the branch. The times when you don't see it, maybe W, but even W, like the study Bioko showed, it's showing up in Nubia. So maybe with Bioko, like I haven't looked at that old study yet, but even with W, maybe it's different, because you don't really see it that deep into modern Africa that I know of. You see it like just on the coast, but even then, like if you go to the mtDNAi Wikipedia article, and I don't know if I mentioned that when I had it up, but anyway, if anybody listening, you could go to mtDNAi haplogroup I on Wikipedia, and you'll notice that it's referenced with Kenya, but the map doesn't show anything below like Middle Egypt or Libya. But again, and that's where I'd say a lot of this is propaganda, racism, but a part of it is just Eurocentrum in the sense that, like with you, and this kind of surprised me, like U6 being the oldest branch with you, they probably just found it later and that's where it's got its name. I don't know, somebody could correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume a lot of times, like even with T, branches of T, they find whatever first with the Europeans. They were tested way back when they first started with autosomal testing.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, like, this is one of the reasons why, like, I publish what I publish, because I just been accumulating data for so long that it just wouldn't make sense for it to die with me, without my own assessments and critiques. So, I encourage y'all, if to consider it at least, putting that out there. Go ahead.
I try. It's hard to commit. It's like starting a hobby,
Yeah.
and ooh, I want to learn how to play guitar. You go buy play a guitar, you pick it up one time, and you're like, man, this is hard. And I've done that. I've given away the guitar,
Yeah.
But I do have a shameless plug. I do have a site. I don't post on it too often. I haven't posted in maybe a year. It is www.astenb.com. That's ASTENB. And I just post a few, articles here and there. I'll get something that I think is interesting, and I'll put it up and comment on it. For a long time, I've been thinking about like having something like this, but each time an article comes out, just picking it apart and then giving like a narrative of what we think it means. But it takes a lot of coordination. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of commitment. How many people were supposed to show up today?
I think we're only missing one other, and that's Jari.
Okay.
And so y'all came through. So it's only one other that I think we're missing. And but yeah, I was going to even suggest that, like, if y'all willing to come back, we could narrow the scope to a specific article or something like that, and then kind of break it down. We would just decide which one it is, and set a date and just pick it apart. And I was even considering, I got to see if either Rick Kittles or Shamarka Keita is down, to just have y'all all on as a panel, with Keita or Kittles, or even, saying someone else, because he's given me some other good names, of people in this field. So you have at least the one professional, and we just all, again, that's why I call it a scholars town hall. So it's just like if we was, in a town hall meeting debating a particular issue. I think that would be beneficial, saying to the public. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't any specified agenda per se, saying for this conversation. So I wanted to kind of leave it open to see where we could go in terms of recent conversations, at least on EgyptSearch.com. So we've been on 2 hours and 10 minutes, and so I don't know how much time y'all have, but I wanted to at least thank y'all for coming on and sharing your knowledge and opinions and research with my audience, at least. And I'm pretty sure that they are appreciative as well. And for all those who have come and joined the conversation, both on Facebook and on YouTube. And so I'm gonna open it up now for any questions for the people on the panel, before we go. So I know there's going to be a time delay. So, I'm going to give it a second. And so while y'all are, possibly thinking of a particular question, is there anything else anyone wants to say about anything in particular?
I had something on my mind, but I forgot.
Hold on. So haplogroup E. So I'm just finding stuff, so I'm gonna put this on. So I don't know what the nature of the discussion was prior. So someone saying so haplogroup E isn't Eurasian. What was going on in that discussion?
Absolutely not.
Well, the evidence that would say it is, they haven't found. So, in my opinion, what they should be looking for is Eurasian specific, very early lineages of E, precursors of E in Eurasia. And the thing is, they have a whole bunch of ancient DNA, and there is no E. Like, if y'all would have had it by now. So it's kind of obvious. We had a whole bunch of basal E samples. Then we had DE samples, and then we're saying, well, since D is not found in Africa, then blah blah blah, and now we have D in West Africa. So, and then you have the very early branches of haplogroup E. I can't say the specific mutations, but those are in Ethiopia, showing some real early splits. And then you have E1A in West Africa, and you have E2. Like, what are y'all doing?
Yeah.
It's like, it's not even funny.
Yeah,
it's not even funny.
The E1A is only found in Iberia, in ancient sample. I believe some modern samples have it. Some modern people have it too as well, but it's only found due to migration of Africans north as well, right? So it's these E2 and E1 are essentially almost uniquely African branches upstream. There is no question about it. E is definitely an African branch. I don't understand the debate.
One thing I can say though, I think the frequency we have now sort of obscures the history, and I think a lot of early stuff is sub-Saharan because, of course, that's where. Well, I mean, at least we think based on the fossils, that's the only place people can come from. But I think a lot of the evolutionary history is going to be North African. So, I mean, especially coming out of the Holocene, a lot of stuff is going to be Saharan. Yeah. And so, as the studies start to come in and roll in, I think we're going to be saying like, oh, that's North African, that's North African, that's North African. Even E1B1B or M35, I would say E1A, M2, A3B2. I don't really know where to stop. A lot of them are, if they're not North African, they're better described as North African based on the most recent migration southward, because everything, when you look at the migration history, all the recent stuff is from north to south. It's like a strong sift from north to south. A lot of the maternal lineages too, north to south.
Yeah, this is going to be important going forward as well, because we are going to probably find out that most of these lineages that we call sub-Saharan African are just either Saharan or probably North Saharan or Northern African. But it's also a misnomer, because when you say North African, you assume modern North African in terms of phenotype, right, or in terms of how they look. So we got to prepare to transition from using like sub-Saharan, like that partition sub-Saharan, like these people were always below the Sahara and looked like this because they were below the Sahara for hundreds of thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. When around during the Holocene, a lot of our lineages and a lot of our ancestry probably were in the Sahara or above, etc. So,
okay, we have a question. Is it showing up? Okay, so it's for Stro. It says, what mitochondrial DNA haplogroups do they classify as North African?
They as in.
I assume scientists and geneticists.
Well, right now I know they give U6 to West North Africa and M1 to Northeast Africa, and that's it. That's it.
Someone asked
On that,
oh, go ahead.
say not enough. Far too little. Like North Africa, by and large, and you could probably combine the Levant, are the seeds of most, at least West Asian and European lineages. I'd put it on that. Like that. I mean, you still, and this is one Clyde Winters likes to bring up, is you find A2, like the Native American A2, the maternal A2 in Mende. You know, like I think it's only found in one person, one little study, but it's also in 23andMe heat maps in West Africa and Egypt. So if you have that much of a climb from Native Americans to the point where it's all the way in West Africa, because I don't think Mayans were hopping on boats and crossing the Pacific. But
I don't know about that.
It's possible. But considering that climb isn't just like the Native American haplogroups, it's damn near all of Europe, to the point where I'm like, well, which ones don't have that pattern? That's been what I'm looking for, is like, can I find something based on completely objective, looking at who has the pattern of back migration, who doesn't, because some don't. Like it's not just W, it's Y chromosomal L you almost never see. Like D you do not see. You got DO and DE. You don't see Y chromosome D in Africa. I don't think, you barely see it in West Asia. But with the Arab invasions, they didn't bring any D over to Egypt. Like, as much as Egyptians are tested, I don't think I've ever seen like a scrape of D, like 0.0%. So you can start to build some objective patterns based on what's not there. So, but that's what I want to say. Like, when it comes to North Africa, it's got to be more than what we're seeing. Like, what about X? X has the same pattern. X1 is the older and fatter branch. It's in Africa, but the major diversity is outside of Africa and downstream from that. So maybe it'll change. But for now, I would say it's like the one Stro mentioned, one branch of E, U6. And other than that, this place that if you take the bootstrap, not sure what you would call those bootstrap charts they do with animals when they do it with Homo sapiens, they'll show that the descendants of, the ancestors for Eurasians start to go into Bedouins and into like Mozabites and Berbers and Sahrawi. So the bootstrap charts are showing the same thing, but then you look at like where haplogroups are assigned when it comes to origin, and North Africa gets no love.
I want to chime in on the Albert Einstein thing. His paternal ancestor was African. His father's all the way back. If it's haplogroup E, he's African. And, it is what it is. But another thing about the Levant, technically, that is geographic Africa. When you go on by tectonic plates to name which continents are continents, if you look up the continental plates, Levant sits on the African plate. Not Arabia, that's its own, but the Levant and the Sinai is on the African plate. So that's like I always say that to people, they get to going on, well, technically, that's Africa anyways. And it's nothing they can say to it because it's right.
All right. So we have another question. Stro, did you say Natufuans were more African? I'm sorry?
I'm reading the comment, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Did you say the Natufuans were more African than Africans? If so, can you elaborate?
Okay. I didn't say that they were more African than Africans is in terms of Africans. I say they were more African than the Abu Sir samples. Right, just to clarify. So what I meant by that is so when you run those samples, the Natufians, because of their age, because they're so old, right? I know when the study first released, I'm not trying to go off too much, but when the study first released, it was very big because it seemed like they were unrelated to Africans completely, right? But that was in the presence of some people of populations who had Natufian ancestry, like strong Natufian related ancestry, right? And as the years go along, when you do more approaches, we find like glimpses of African here, glimpses of African there. Once we run admixture, for example, and develop a Northeast African component, you'll see that the Natufians will consistently score high, right? But not only that, in the last admixture chart that I have released, we also had another component, which is definitive of the some of the early hunter-gatherers, and even like the pastoralists in East Africa, right? And then the Natufians will score Northeast African as well as some of that Omotic related. I'm not trying to define it as Omotic, but it's Omotic related ancestry or East African hunter-gatherer related ancestry, right? Ancestry which wasn't found in the Abu Sir sample. So I'm guessing it's due to the age of the Natufians being so old that, of course, they would have had less. They would have more diversity within their genome. To put it simply, they would have more diversity within their genome and carry more relicit or relic ancestry related to Africans. You understand? But they were more fundamentally African, just going by that going by many other methods as well than the Abu Sir samples. So that's what I meant when I mentioned that earlier.
All right. The next one, I don't know if this is necessarily directed at me, but back migration seemed to be a real thing, like what we saw with the Tafarat study. Is there a chance ancient Egyptians might be of a similar composition, African and Eurasian? Anybody want to?
So this is
the short answer. Do the short answer and then do the long answer.
Okay, so the issue was that the partition that we mentioned earlier is like you're either Eurasian or Sub-Saharan African, right? But they don't really allow for the in between. And going back when dealing with populations who are extinct, they were probably somewhere in between before the partitions were created due to isolations. You understand? So yes, we probably had back migration, but we don't know how that looks like genetically. Like the Tafarat, for instance, over half of their DNA to most likely a lineage that was a line of Africans, ancestral North African, right, which was produced in recent studies by Lazarus in an unreleased paper about the Asian Caucasian samples that they have, Jojoana, I believe it's called. But anyways, yeah. So there was back migrations, of course, but how do you interpret what's African and what's Eurasian when going back the partition is blurred? Like it's not just Sub-Saharan African, and if you're not Sub-Saharan African, you're not African.
Not African.
Yeah,
that's something that Keita would stress all of the time. Like there's no one way to be African. That, which you're calling kind of in between is just another subset of Africans, in that. And then we got to look at the complexity of just ancient Egypt in itself. So you have, individuals that have been there since, it's 40, 50,000 years, even going back further, in what we call the Nile Valley. And then when what we're calling the Sahara starts to green up, you see some of them moving into the Sahara. And then you have people from like the Sudan moving into the Sahara. Then you have people like from Chad moving into the Sahara. So once the desiccation starts to happen in between 6,000 and 3,500 BCE, you're starting to see now people who have mixed in the Sahara migrating in all different directions, but of course repopulating the Nile Valley itself. So, you know, what kind of profile, if you're trying to make an identity out of a genetic profile, you know, how do you separate who are the indigenous folks there at around, you know, and I'm talking around the, you know, anywhere from, you know, 35 to 3200 BCE in terms of the formation of the political state of ancient Kemet. When you have people who have been there and micro evolved there, then you have these flux of people coming in from the Sahara and others coming in from the South itself. So, you know, what does that DNA profile look like? And, you know, how do you separate that? Again, for me, it's the issue of you can't say because you just don't have that many samples, because you would need a whole bunch of old Saharan samples, of course, with old ancient Egyptian samples, and of course, coming from the South unto itself. And I think like people neglect hold on one second. I got my book here, Illusion Volume 2, shameless plug. You know, when we're talking about, where did I put it in this text? This is over 550 pages, 8.5 by 11. So I kind of forget where I put stuff sometimes, but I need to find the biblical verse where in the Bible they talk about the Egyptians, and they know who are the Egyptians themselves. And, you know, God is supposed to cast out the Egyptians out of Israel and bring them back to their homeland. And it specifically talks about what we would consider Upper Egypt, which is the lower part. And I found that very interesting that they would specify that they would bring the Egyptians back to their home in the southern part of what we call, you know, saying Egypt today. And so to me, this says a lot about, you know, who are the Egyptians themselves, not in terms of citizenry, but in terms of ethny, you know, who probably were just an elite class, over kind of like how the French was when they invaded Britain, you know, for that long time period, which is why we have a whole bunch of French loan words into English. It wasn't like a whole state of France came and settled into Britain, but enough of them came and settled and ruled to where French was the language of prestige and learning, while you still had your Celts in English speakers, because it's really kind of the Celts who adopted a Germanic language, and this is, you know, that kind of mixture is what became English. And then on top of the French invasion and all of the loan words from the French, who ironically were Germanic speakers originally, who adopt Latin, and that evolved and became French. So it tells you about like these genetic, how it's kind of iffy when you're trying to mix DNA and linguistics together, because DNA wise, the French are Germanic speaking people related to the Dutch and Germans and English. But they adopted the Romance language, the Latin language, and then that evolved into French. But I need to find that particular verse. But like we neglect those bits of history when it comes to the identification of the ancient Egyptians themselves. And so even I don't consider the Bible a history book at all. But just like in any I have to find it later. Just like any modern movie or mythology, you could place New York City, in the film, and if you're in Harlem and Sylvia's, and we know that exists, but the storyline which you see in the film may not have went down like that in real life, and that's how I look at the biblical text. But even the Bible itself says the Egyptians are the ones who are at the south. So at least at this time, that may be telling as well as far as the Delta area and who was all there at this time of the writings of the Bible, that they didn't consider them Egyptians, but the true Egyptians were the ones, in the south. But hold on, I think there was a who is this? A Eurasian origin and back migration to Africa has been proposed for the African Y chromosome haplogroup E. Inside Africa, frequency distributions of maternal L3 and paternal E lineages are, it looks like your comment was cut off, so I don't even know what you're trying to say there. Ashkenazi Jews also tend to be a part of haplogroup E. Einstein had E1B1B. At that point is because everyone wants to be E1B1. Okay, y'all having your own conversations in this chat. I'm scrolling down trying to.
With that last question, I thought it was interesting because using Taffurod as an example of back migration, can you see why someone would come to the exact opposite conclusion, considering how old Taffurod is and the people that live there now, what was shown there? I mean, it's not like there's a major break. Taffurod had North African haplogroups from like 16,000 years ago. I wouldn't use that as an example of back migration, because if it was for migration, it would have North African haplogroups. So I don't know, like with Taffurod or really with you, it comes down to two things. The case that it originated outside of Europe is based on finding an old novel U. I don't know, maybe somebody remembers the exact location. I think it was in maybe Slovenia. And that makes a good case. The case for Africa is it has an early branch that's big and diverse in U6. And you kind of come to your conclusions from that. And Africa always has ancestors, everything. And those ancestors tend to have big early branches too, which I'd argue is what you would see if it diversified in Africa first and then bounce in clumps, where you have, because it'd be different if Africa, like, I'll give you an example of a back migrated pattern. Most people, like most lineages, are going to be more successful the newer they are because they grow exponentially. So if I'm finding like R1B, 1AB, like a big strand of R that's more recent and it's related to modern Europeans, then that's back migrated. If you find like D in Africa, in a big thing, then maybe you have like a Chinese immigrant or something like that. I don't even know where D is. I think it's Japan and China, but different places in Asia. But that's just what I wanted to bring out is, like, I thought that was kind of odd that they're making the case for back migration with Taffurod, because I would have looked at it the other way if you didn't find a U, and I think HV or H was in the Taffurod study. Then I'm thinking, well, maybe those lineages haven't arrived yet. But I mean, I think they were like 16,000-year-old Moroccans.
Well, you actually make a good point. But because at the end of the day, this might or might not be the case, but Tafara could literally be a mixture of ancestral North African and ancestral Northeast African and have the exact same autosomal profile, technically speaking, because all you need is Natufian, right? And we know Natufian have Northeast African and admixture, and you need a Sub-Saharan African to model Tafara, right? So yeah, it can be. They came to the conclusion though for the back migration, because they had to use the Natufians to model the non-African portion of Tafarat's DNA. You understand? It's because we have an absence of representative samples to definitively say this autosomal component is African, which is why they can label, and I don't want to use the term they as if they're the enemy, but it's why they can label these things as non-African, because we do not have the representative samples right now. You understand? I look at it differently, and I can see like, oh, this portion of Tafarel's DNA could have just been in Africa this whole time. And I believe there was like a study that came. It wasn't really a study, but it was a review of a couple of studies about what is really African, and they were talking about how basal Eurasian could be ubiquitous in Africa, which it kind of probably is, and we just don't know yet. But it have been sitting in Northeast Africa for thousands of years, and et cetera, and et cetera. The problem is just that we have an absence of representative samples, and we don't have people willing to look at these things from an African perspective. But I won't dismiss back migration because I do not know. You understand? But I know that people were moving in and out of Africa, and I won't deny that fact at the same time. But what it means on an autosomal level, we do not know yet until we have the right samples to make these conclusions. That's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I want to chime in on the lack of samples. I remember 23andMe way back in the days where Ethiopians were coming up as 80 and 90% Europeans, because it was basically Japanese, European, and Yoruba. And that was it. K equals 3. You spit in the tube, you're East African. Kenyans were coming up, 30%, 40% Asian. It was just all off without the samples. And let me do a quick screen share and show an image. Let me know when you can see it. Any luck?
Hold on. It doesn't seem like your screen is sharing.
Okay, let me go back. Application window. Okay, I see how it is. How about now?
All right. There you go.
And this is basically a breakdown, if you can see this, of participants in genome-wide association studies. These aren't actually ancestry studies exclusively, but basically this is what you're dealing with. As you see, Europeans, the vast majority of the studies are on them.
Yeah.
And African is like teeny tiny. It's the same for ancestry. It's the same for uniparentals. That's pretty much it. The vast majority of the studies that they're doing are on themselves, and they've done a pretty good job of reconstruction, their own history. And so without those samples, a lot of stuff is like shooting in the dark.
Well, that goes to, of course, we have the issue of colonialism, which allowed for them to accumulate a lot of wealth over the past 400 years, where they could fund the studies about themselves,
right?
Because it's the same thing in linguistics. So when it comes to understanding the language families, not much is known better than Indo-European, because of course with the study of historical comparative linguistics, it starts with Europeans, and they put a lot of funding behind the collection of vocabulary and developing grammars across Europe and going into Asia as well. Same thing, even with the African languages. A lot is known about Semitic versus even Berber to an extent, which is why in Christopher Ehret's 1995 work, you don't find Berber in his study of Afroasiatic because it wasn't as well known. But we had the same issue in the genetics on the African side as we do with the linguistics. You know, you just find more grammars and things for Indo-European languages than you do for African languages, and they're still discovering African languages. You know, and so yeah, I could see how that is the case, but of course, that is, to me, what you just showed is a direct result of colonialism and slavery, which allowed them to accumulate a lot of wealth to ultimately be able to fund these types of studies. But I'm gonna ask just a few more questions, and then I'm gonna end the program because we're going on 3 hours now, and I don't know if these gentlemen have work in the morning. It seems to already be morning because you said you're in Japan.
I'm in China now.
Oh, in China. Do you work out there, or you just you got stuck out of there because of coronavirus?
It's actually both. It's actually both. I would be back in New York now if it wasn't for the outbreak. But.
Well, I'm gonna go back to this question here. Someone says, could you ask the panel why L2B1A2 haplogroup, I assume, is so limited in information, and the RM269, is it really European or no? Anybody can answer that.
I can answer the first part of the question. And it's because it's African. That's why. That's why it's so little information.
All right. Yeah, I don't know about that the second one.
One thing I did notice about RM269, and I had to look it up to see if this was the one I was thinking about. I think it is I would assume, since most of it is in Europe, that, you know, regardless of where R originated, it originated in Europe. The only caveat with that would be, I think it was also found in South African Bushmen. Now, if it's found in South African, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm looking it up, see if I can double check that, or maybe it was Ferrero's. Let's see, 269 regions. So, but anyhow, like I do remember seeing it in Southern Africa. Like, I think it was in South Africa, and it was with a population that probably wasn't going to be mixed with colonialism, because, you know, like when they try to test Africans, they try to keep it indigenous. So I would assume that regardless of where its ancestors came from, that it probably originated in Europe, but I'm not 100. I think the Green Sahara is in play with some of those branches, or maybe even like Central Europe. I don't know, but I'd lean towards where it's mostly located now, but I would also include like Green Sahara and Algeria, you know, which is Sahara. But, and I'm just saying that because I remember seeing it in a location where, okay, maybe it spread in different directions, and with all the competition you have in Africa, it's kind of hard to really blow up, because you already have a big branch of R and R1B. And then you have E, which is huge. So it's conceivable, but I don't know. I just remember seeing one study that made me think otherwise.
Appreciate it. Radio One mentioned, I'm still trying to find the exact verse, but he is correct that when I was talking about the particular Bible verse that talks about exiling the Egyptians from where they're from, what is called in the Bible is a place is called Pathros, which is like Pa-ta-Resi. That's the Egyptian name. Pa-ta-Resi, which is the south. So Resi is the head. So their up is our south. So it's in Lower Egypt, in the lower part of Egypt, on the border of Sudan. So like it specifically says their origin. So even the biblical writers understood that the origin of the Egyptians were in that Taseti Egyptian, saying in Nubian confluent zone, which is very telling in of itself. It's just like when you think about when Herodotus and other Greeks were speaking of the Egyptians, calling them black skin with woolly hair. And this is during the time of major influx of Asiatics into Egypt, and when the Europeans were ruling Egypt. But even then, they were still able to identify who the Egyptians were and describe them in terms of their phenotype. So it would be no different than being in the United States with all these Europeans who have rushed here. But we are able to tell the difference between an Englishman and a Cherokee or a Mayan or whatnot, and be able to describe them accurately in comparison to the Europeans. But I'm gonna continue trying to scroll down. That's okay, nationalism. I don't think I know I missed a question somewhere. If I missed it, I missed it. So I'll just end here. So I apologize if I missed your question. This thing kind of scrolls on its own, and so the more y'all type, the more that it pushes up comments. So it is what it is. So I just wanted to say again that I thank you, brothers, for joining me in this conversation for the first Scholars Town Hall, as I call it, because I couldn't think of any other name. Good brothers from EgyptSearch.com, and I'm pretty sure other forums in which they post in, but just wanted to kind of bring those conversations in that forum to this type of space, in a kind of verbal space. So it's rare that a lot of us who interact with each other via a listserv or a message board forum get to engage verbally like this. So it is very much appreciated, and I've been seeing some of the comments, and the audience has been very appreciative of this exchange as well. So I hope we can do this again in the near future. If you do not mind and people have any other questions, let them know where they can reach you on social media. If you want to give that information out, or just, join EgyptSearch.com and kind of follow the discussions there. So I'll start with 42 Stro and then end with Bioku. And y'all can have, whatever final words as you give out that information.
Oh, thanks. I'm just glad to be on it. I've learned a lot, and I'll probably listen to this again and pick up some things I might have missed. Some good topics. I have a YouTube channel that I'm not really that active on lately, but I'm alive because I haven't. The coronavirus was twerking in the streets like it is. Everyone know who doesn't see me on Egypt Search or Facebook with the Rory Frizen account that I am alive. I'm okay. I'm just taking it easy, doing some things. I'm currently studying Python and getting into trying to do a couple programs a day since I'm stuck inside and trying to get my resume sharp and make more money. Also, I'm pitching the movie script to a lady. Oh, let me see if I can look her up. Maybe y'all can ping her at one point. If they say no, you can say, "Damn, I was looking forward to that." But I might have to put it in the chat. Maybe I'll pull it up once I find it and just mention it. I'll triple me. Actually, let me see. I think I have it right here. But maybe I don't. Well, I'll pull it up later. But that's what I've been up to. I'll get back on the channel eventually. Now I'm doing a lot more studying than reporting what I'm studying, because that's basically what the channel was created for. I would study stuff and say, you know what, other people should know this too, and that's been most of my channels. That and a lot of commentary in relation to ADOS stuff like that. Where's my? I thought I found it. Okay, yeah, I did find it. My computer's just slow, so it'll be up in a second.
But they can find you if they search 42 tribes, correct?
Yeah,
on YouTube.
You'll find me and I think another Kenyan channel. Well, another Kenyan channel. I'm not Kenyan. I'm African American, but you'll find a Kenyan channel because they kind of have like a 42 tribes thing in Kenya. That's one of the reasons I picked that, because it was seeing that relationship with what how one of the teachers, the guy who taught young Pharaoh's teacher, Hakeem Ayan. He said that that there was 42 nomes, districts, and he said that understanding might have been a mistake. He thinks it was tribes, and then I found out about the 42 tribes of Kenya, which is not 42, but I guess they rounded to that because it's like a holy number. It's catchy, and so that's what I came up with the name for the YouTube channel. And I found the name Megan Culberson Saturday, Culberson, if you want to look it up, trying to pitch the script to that. So I've been on stage 32, that studying and doing whatever work I can from home, since we are in a quarantine, and I want to give a shout out to the people who are forced to break it and should be getting hazard pay but aren't. Thanks again for the panel. I'll see you on Chip Search.
All right, no doubt.
Keep it real simple because most of my domains aren't set up yet. So you can contact me via email at if you need to contact me immediately, you can do it via email at sunisha.genomes@gmail.com or on Egypt Search. And I'll let you know when I get my blog up and things of that nature.
All right.
Byoku. You can contact me on Egypt Search, Byoku, Beyouku, or on my site, astenb.com. Email is asten@astenb.com. Thank you for the invite. Looking forward to doing this again.
All right. Someone asked in the chat directed towards me, do I have my own group outside of the Amin-Ra Squad forum? I do not. I mean, I have my own website, of course, which is asarimhotep.com. And it has a social media component that functions like Facebook. But I have been contemplating doing a China Into /Negro Egyptian Facebook forum. And so if I decide to do that, I will announce it. And so for people who want to know more about how to do historical comparative linguistics, what are kind of the ins and out of that process and what to look for when looking at language studies and cultural studies, that will be one of the main hubs. And then, of course, on my website itself. So be on the lookout for that in the future. But thank you again, gentlemen. I appreciate y'all greatly. Thank you to all the listeners, both on YouTube and on Facebook. Please like and share. For those of you who are new to my channel, I request and encourage you to subscribe so that when we have more conversations like this, you will be notified. If you didn't happen to catch me on Facebook or YouTube or Instagram or anything to that nature, hit the bell, like and share, and keep the conversations going in your own personal circles. And look these brothers up, hit them up with a ton of questions, get their mind and their mojo going, and keep advancing the work. So thank you all. Oh, and tomorrow I have another guest coming, Dr. Adisa Ajamu, who is a psychologist out of Los Angeles with the Townhall Institute. And so we're going to be talking about a variety of different things. His work, looking at COVID-19 from a mental health and a Black psychology and African psychology perspective, and things of that nature. I've had him on the show before, way back in 2015. Him and Dr. Wade Nobles on at the same time. So this one will be dedicated and focused on his work. And then on Saturday night, we're going to have changed the vibe up a little bit from the scholarship. And we're going to have our mixtape mashup part 2. And so there's going to be a few guests that come on, and we're going to see who would be the better DJs, in these quarantine streets and clubs, and see who got the hot. I used to DJ back in the day, in my early college days, and so this will be fun. So we had one already, and we're going to do it again. So that's Saturday, the 2nd, for the mixtape mashup part 2, and then tomorrow, which is the 30th, the 30th of April, at 1 p.m. Well, I'll just say 4 p.m. Eastern time, 1 p.m. Pacific. So he'll be in California. So tune in, subscribe, share, continue the conversation, and enjoy my background. I don't know if I'll keep this one in the next one, so I'll be switching the background. So I'm testing the green screen. See y'all later. God bless y'all. Good night.
Good night.
Peace.